Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 3 game from the Chicago Open. Now, if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I've won 2 games in a row now, and that's a good start in an open tournament. And so in this one, I knew I would finally be playing up. Now, it turned out my opponent in this one was none other than Grandmaster Illya Nyzhnyk, well-known player around American Open circles these days because he's been a student at Webster University for some time now. And so he's been another one of these really talented chess players that's essentially gone to one of the quote-unquote chess colleges, as I call them, and is tearing it up on the open scene. And I can actually remember hearing the name Illya Nyzhnyk for the first time almost about 10 years ago, because at the time, when he was like 13 or 14, he was actually one of the youngest grandmasters ever. So he's actually had quite a long and storied chess career, even at the ripe young age of 23, as he is now, and a lot of respect for where he's gone and where he's been as a chess player. He's originally from the Ukraine, and yeah, like I said, he's studying at Webster now, and I believe he's now the captain of the Webster chess team. In any case, a tough test. So I was white in this one, and I was hoping to put a little bit of pressure on him, but I didn't want to take tremendous risk because I did kind of maybe respect him quite a bit, and I didn't want to like do anything too crazy. And so actually, I opened with d4, and after d5, c4, and c6, I was actually already quite surprised because I didn't figure that he would go for the Slav. And, you know, I thought about it for a little bit, and I was like, well, I'm not so sure I had anything against this particular line on that day, and I wasn't sure if he was going to go for a semi-Slav or a Dutch Slav or a6 Slav, and I didn't necessarily want to find out. So I actually went c takes d5 and kind of cut out the funny business immediately. And yeah, the exchange variation isn't particularly ambitious, you might say, but I thought that given the strength of my opponent, he might actually try to mix it up in a way that might actually give me chances, because I figured that, you know, Illya would not be so comfortable with a draw, so that, you know, playing, you know, over 200 points down, he would, you know, kind of do something perhaps a little bit suspect to give himself some winning chances. So that's kind of what my thought process was. And after c takes d5, I went knight f3, which is not even the most ambitious way you could play this system. You can actually go knight c3, and then if they go like knight f6, you can go bishop f4. And the point is you go e3, bishop d3, and knight ge2. And yeah, I just, again, I didn't want to get into any sort of theory battle with him at all. I just want a relatively sterile position where if he was going to want to win the game, he would try to have to show something quite dynamic. And yeah, so I actually went knight f3. And after knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop f4, bishop f5, e3, and e6, we have a completely symmetrical position. And I actually was frankly quite surprised that Illya was going to go for a position that was, you know, completely symmetrical. He did not strive to take any unusual imbalance in the position. He didn't try to, like, you know, harass my bishop on f4 right away. Sometimes when people want to play for a win in the system, they actually go for knight h5 here. And the point is that if I go bishop g5, h6, and bishop h4, you can actually go g5 and secure the bishop pair and play a little bit more dynamically. So I was surprised that he didn't go for something like this to try and keep some winning chances alive. But, you know, he was content to just play the symmetrical position and say, you know what, I can probably beat you here in the long run. And I must say, I want to give him some credit for that, because I don't think most people would play the same exact way against everyone, and it was clear that maybe he was going to play the same exact way regardless of the opponent and just trust that he was going to get some chances down the line. And just a little bit of foreshadowing, it turned out he did indeed get those chances. So anyway, so I went bishop d3. This is kind of normal in this completely symmetrical position. Bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and then the normal move in this position is actually bishop d6. And the point is that I take here, and then queen takes, and there have been many draws in positions like this where, you know, the game is completely symmetrical, and, you know, I mean, I wasn't necessarily angling for a dead drawn position after 20 moves, but I was aware that this possibility existed, and I thought, okay, I'm playing a 26 50, 26, like 2600 plus type of player, it's not the end of the world if that happens. So I just thought, he was going to try and imbalance the game at some juncture. And it turned out that after queen takes d3, instead of playing bishop d6, Illya went for the move rook c8. And this was a move that I thought was a little bit premature because he's not developing his bishop. He's keeping my bishop on this long diagonal. But in hindsight, this is actually a very, very interesting way to play. And definitely keep this idea in mind with rook c8 and his follow-up, which we're going to see in a moment, because it's actually a very, very interesting way to get a winning attempt in this structure without, having to do anything special. So anyways, after rook c8, I castled. I thought, okay, if he's not, developing his bishop and I castle, he's going to have to develop it eventually, and, we're just going to go back to this position where after bishop d6, we'll take, I'll go rook c1, and we'll get the same type of position again. Well, wrong. Turns out after castling, Illya decided not to go for bishop d6, and instead went for the move bishop e7. And this little difference, bishop e7 instead of bishop d6, really sets the contours for the game, because what you have now is a bishop on f4 that's fairly active and unopposed, but the question is, how good is it really? And this bishop on e7, it's allowing the bishop on f4 to be unchallenged and is mainly a defensive piece right now, but maybe it'll probe on some of these squares later in the game. And so the real question essentially is, can you leave the bishop on this diagonal unchecked? And is that a significant thing or not? And it actually turns out that, bishop e7 is actually a quite interesting and smart, ambitious attempt, because my bishop on f4, believe it or not, is not actually hitting anything. So if it's not actually, really influencing any really super relevant squares that black's pieces might actually want to occupy, it's not actually the fiercest bishop in the world. And so we're going to see in a moment what I mean by that. But after bishop e7, I went h3. Maybe this move was not super precise. The point was to preserve my bishop on this diagonal. Note that if I make a move like rook ac1, I thought maybe knight h5 would be a possibility, just trying to secure this bishop. And okay, even if I dropped the bishop back, no harm, no foul. Ooh, well, there would be a foul if I played f takes g3, but after h takes g3, no harm, no foul here, in terms of my pawn structure isn't so bad, but the point is the bishop versus knight can feature as something that is a significant factor at some point. And now, of course, I'm going to always be reluctant to make any pawn breaks because all my pawns are on dark squares. So I just didn't want to go for that particular exchange, and because of that, I just decided to play h3 to give myself that h2 square. But after castles and rook ac1, now black played a very, very interesting move, and the move was a6. And the funny thing about this bishop e7, bishop f4 dynamic right now is that, again, my bishop isn't really hitting anything on this diagonal that's super relevant. And now with this move a6, because I've also played h3, black's actually starting the operations on the queen side faster than I am. And usually as the white player in a symmetrical position, you think, oh, well, you're going to be the one that has, the half tempo, the extra move to get a little bit of an advantage. But the more I realized, the more it seemed to me that, I was the one that had to decide whether I wanted to copy or not. And it seemed like black from this moment was actually the one playing the white pieces. And so if I copy, for instance, let's say I play a move like a3 and copy. Well, there are a few problems there. First of all, I thought I'm weakening some light squares. And you might say, well, that's not such a big deal. There's no light square bishop. Well, the issue in a lot of these lines is this knight can come over and really mess you up on the light squares. Secondly, I'm putting this pawn on a dark square where it could potentially be a target for black's bishop. And so I think that's the other point about keeping these bishops on the board is black's dark square bishop actually has the potential to harass my pawns, whereas my bishop on f4 is not really doing anything to influence black's queenside pawns that are on light squares. So these little details really made me quite uncomfortable, and I think it, already gave black at least the practical chances in the game. So after a6, I opted not to play a3 because of the reasons I just indicated, and thought, okay, I'm going to go knight e5, try to trade a few more pieces, and maybe I won't have to play a3 to stop knight b4. Because in a lot of these lines, what white wants to do is go rook c1 and rook c2 and rook fc1 to double rooks, and then eventually move the knight and trade on the c file. But you can't really accomplish that if there's a fork on this queen on d3 and a rook on c2. So that dynamic kind of encouraged me to try and exchange a few more pieces before doing that. So I went knight e5, thinking, okay, if I trade these knights, this might be a good thing for me. But Illya was not having any of it and went for the move knight a5. And this move is extremely strong for a few reasons. First of all, it eyes the c4 square, which is going to be a little bit sensitive because black has so much good light square control of that square right now. Secondly, if a knight comes there, it creates a little bit of imbalance because I'm going to be reluctant to play knight takes c4 because after d takes c4, black has a queenside pawn majority that could be a factor. Thirdly, my knight on e5 and this bishop on f4, they look nice, but what are they really doing? And this is actually kind of the issue in this structure right now is the difference in bishops I've already talked about. And now we're also going to see the difference in queen's knights. My knight on c3 versus this knight on a5. This knight on c3 is usually not very good in the exchange Slav and needs to be rerouted somewhere else to be a factor. But you see, black has already initiated this process before I have. And it again adds to the idea that it seems like black is playing the white pieces. So after knight a5, I went rook c2. I thought, okay, at least now that the knight is not on c6, I can go for this doubling maneuver. And now black went for the move knight d7. And very smart decision, because if black is able to dislodge this knight from e5, all of a sudden this knight comes to c4 and it's unassailable. So that's a really important thing. Another thing to note about just exchanges and a knight on c4 is that once this knight comes to c4, I'm going to be really reluctant to kick it with a b3 or a move like that because I weaken more squares on the queen side and in particular give the a3 square to one of black's minor pieces, potentially. So there's just a lot of reluctance to push the A or B pawns because they actually kind of become targets, which is not the same thing, the same issue that black's dealing with his A6 and B7 pawn. Last but not least, when you actually do push the B pawn, the C3 knight becomes a little bit more unstable. So these are kind of the dynamics you have to keep in mind. So after knight d7, I actually took on d7, but an argument could have been made that I could have continued with rook fc1 instead, just doubling the rooks like I intended to do, and not necessarily panicking right away and exchanging, because when I exchange, I actually help connect black's rooks, and that's something that you probably shouldn't have done. I think in some lines I was thinking maybe the queen on d7 would be less of a factor because it's not protecting the knight on a5 anymore. But in fact, the queen's actually quite well placed on d7 because it actually stops me from going knight a4 in a lot of positions. So probably shouldn't have nudged it there. After queen takes d7, I went for rook fc1. And black now went knight c6 back. And again, a really good judgment here by a strong Grandmaster. Because I think most people would say, well, now that the knight on e5 is gone, I'm just going to put it back on c4. That was the whole idea to begin with. Well, the dynamic in this position is that after knight c4, I probably would have gone for knight b1, believe it or not. And the point is now I'm actually ready to play b3 because my knight will be actually covering the a3 square. So even though it is a little bit sensitive, it wouldn't be the end of the world. And if I trade, all the rooks off, it's, likely going to be an equal position. But by playing knight c6 instead, I have new problems to solve, in particular this knight b4 fork. And again, if I play a3, I weaken more light squares. So if I play a3, now the knight might consider coming back to a5 because they're is new territory to work with on that with this move. And again, once the pawn goes to a3, it becomes a target for this bishop on e7. And just look at the difference in bishops. My bishop hitting nothing, black's bishop hitting something. So very, very, very instructive. So after knight c6, I actually did go a3, and a3 is not a good move. A better move would have been either queen d1 or queen e2, both with the same idea. The point is that after both moves, if knight b4 is played, you just move the rook, and you do without creating this pushing a pawn to a dark square where it becomes a target. Now, it's very hard to play like this. It's clear that black is the one with this, that has a little bit of the initiative here. So it was difficult to just allow the knight to come here. Because the other question is, well, how am I going to evict it? Am I going to play a3, or am I just going to let it sit there forever? So it is a tough decision to make, but it would have been the better decision. So instead, after a3, black now went knight a5 back, and you can see that this is just like a clinic of weak squares, just kind of dancing around this knight, just creating new opportunities for itself. And I felt that I was under serious pressure here, and really I felt like I was getting outplayed. Like I could sense that I was losing a little bit of control here, even in a position that looks to the eye just to be completely, initially it just looks to be equal, but you could just see that my minor pieces are so much worse than black. So yeah, I thought I really need to try and get some pieces off the board. I opted to do so with the move knight b1. The idea was just to, try and trade some rooks, and maybe the weaknesses wouldn't be as disconcerting if more pieces were traded. Not necessarily true, though. A better move, actually, trying to trade the rooks, but in a more active position, would actually be the move knight a4. And frankly, this was a move I missed. Now, the idea with knight a4 is that you can't go queen takes a4 because rook takes c8 and white just wins an exchange in the game. And also, this knight a4 actually threatens this fork on b6. So actually, rook takes c2 would pretty much need to be played. And now I could play queen takes c2, and I actually have control of the c file for a moment. Now, black can go queen b5, and, this queen, as long as it's eyeing the a4 knight, I can't really infiltrate. And but this is a position that is actually a little more tenable for me, given the fact that I've managed to trade some pieces and get some control of the c file. I could go knight c3 back now, and after queen b3, go knight e2. And while it is true that, black still has this light square control, even with the queens off the board, again, this c file being kind of under control gives me reasonable chances, at least equal chances. For instance, if queen takes c2, rook takes c2, if knight c4, just trying to, shut off the c file and noting that I can't push b3 because there might be some issue with this pawn. Well, if I want to be super safe, I can go knight c1 and knight d3. But, if I don't want to be careful, I can also play b3, and this should probably be good enough because after knight takes rook c7, I do, in fact, recover the b pawn because of this double attack. So, yeah, this position is probably about equal now, and there's no huge problems. But I had to see this knight a4 move to, get off this exchange. Now, the issue with the knight on b1 is just it's way more passive and, not really ideal. Now, the reason I went knight b1 as opposed to knight e2 or knight d1 or something is that from the d2 square, it's actually eyeing some of the light squares that, are kind of weak and sensitive in my position. So that was the rationale with that move, to challenge the black knight. So after knight b1, rook takes c2 is played. I actually went rook takes c2. A better move would have actually been queen takes c2. And then after knight c4, I actually could play knight d2. And I think the thing I missed here is that if rook c8 is played, I thought it wasn't such a good idea to line up my queen with the rook. But actually b3 here, does a really good job of, just getting a piece here. Although I must say this is actually quite unclear. My rook on c1 is hanging. Maybe this is not as good as it looks because this pawn chain looks mighty menacing. So actually, maybe this isn't so good. I take that back. But the computer was suggesting queen c2. I think their line, okay, after rook c8, after their line was actually b5, and then taking on c4. But even this position, frankly, is not super pleasant because, again, you can see my pawns are on dark squares, blacks are on light squares, and my pawns are going to be targets. So I'm probably slightly worse even here, but I suppose it's the lesser evil than what happened in the game. In the game after rook takes c2 and rook c8, this was a move I actually completely missed. I didn't realize that, this trade of rooks would also give me big problems. I thought that, if I was trading pieces, surely, and I cleared up the congestion, surely I would be okay. But, yeah, I mean, it turns out that if rook takes c8, queen takes c8, which the computer wants me to play, by the way, already here, the queen is potentially infiltrating on the c file. This knight still eyes those squares. My b pawn doesn't really want to be pushed because it just creates a target on a3, and I'm still actually worse. So the computer wants me to go queen c3 and grovel in this endgame, but you can just see that this is going to be extremely unpleasant. So yeah, kind of tough any way you slice it. I didn't want to get squeezed in that particular variation, so I went for the move rook c3. And the idea with this move was to contest on the file without trading the rooks. So the point is with rook c3, I wanted to go queen c2 next and force black to take me on c3 so that I could play queen takes and control the one open file. Black now played g5, which was actually a huge shocker to me because it just seemed so inconsistent with the type of game that we were getting, this like positional grind. But g5 is actually quite an interesting move and not a bad one by any means. Now, there are some implications long-term to potentially weakening your king, but the point is that black is doing two things in one move. One, he's taking more space on the king side, and he might set up with a move like f6 later, and he's just taking a little bit more space on the king side. Secondly, he's giving his king something on the back rank, or luft from the back rank, and he's doing so with tempo. So very, very interesting move, not totally necessary, but actually one the computer does not mind at all. And I was very impressed with this judgment, this g5 move. I went bishop g3 and thought, okay, this g5 move, yeah, got a tempo, but this pawn sort of stuck out like a sore thumb to me, and I was like getting a little bit excited because I thought in endings I might be able to make it a target. So I wasn't so unhappy with that move. And after bishop g3, now knight c4 was played, and yeah, I still have a tough decision to make. b2 is hanging. My pawns in general are loose, and it's like, what to do? I went queen c2 as I initially planned, trying to just double on this file and then threaten to play b3. And now black went rook c6, good move, ensuring that the b pawn is protecting that rook on c6, much in the way my b pawn is protecting my rook on c3. And now I thought, okay, this was kind of the idea. Black has, shored up the queen side effectively, has taken some space on the king side, and it's still quite difficult for me to move. And so I actually went knight d2, trying to trade some more pieces, alleviate some of that pressure. And now black went for b5. And here I realized, well, this g5 move actually doesn't look too bad because, well, I can't really get to it at all, and it's just more space that black can potentially seize, maybe with f5, maybe with h5, h4, I don't know. g5 just did not look as bad, especially when I'm getting squeezed on the light squares on the queen side. And I thought I had to be pretty radical here to get out of this one, given the circumstance. So I went knight takes c4, and after b takes c4, which was played, I decided to play the move e4. Almost desperately trying to lash out, even though structurally this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You can see all my pawns are on dark squares. This is very disconcerting, but I thought if I do nothing, I'm just going to get squeezed. So I thought, given the fact that g5 has been played, I have to try and aggressively open up the position, even if it means I'm weakening my pawn structure. Also, one thing to note, I just kind of skipped over, is after knight takes c4, black could have also taken with the d pawn, and this would have also been, kind of dangerous. Point being that you have this queenside pawn majority, and you give the queen a nice light square in the middle of the board. After d takes c4, I probably would have gone queen e2, and after queen d5, gone rook c1, and kind of had to reorganize to try and get my majority going in the center, but this would be another complicated line. Anyways, back to the game. Knight takes e4, b takes e4, e4. I'm really taking a little bit of a gamble now because, again, I'm weakening my pawn structure because if I do nothing and just sit here, black will eventually hound. I believe that black would hound the b pawn enough where it would just drop. And so I thought I have to kind of lash out here. And so e4 was my way of doing that. Black played rook b6, again, just trying to actually get at this b-pawn, maybe threaten queen b7 next. Better than rook b6 was actually the move d takes e4, actually. And the point is that after rook takes e4, which was my idea, rook takes, queen takes e4, bishop f6, this is still not actually entirely clear because of the d4 pawn that's a little bit sensitive. And the computer wants me to go bishop e5, which I think would be a tough move to make. I don't know. It just seemed a little bit counterintuitive to push the bishop here and get to this queen endgame, and I'm not so sure I would have done it. Although this is actually the most precise. If I went for a move like queen takes a6, I could really run into some trouble because after queen takes d4, even though white has two connected passed pawns, e3 might be a possibility. One of these pawns might actually drop, and they're not advancing so far anytime soon. And yeah, it's actually quite unclear and tricky position. Anyways, after rook b6, I played e takes d5. I thought I was kind of pleased with this because now e takes d5 is forced to reinforce the c4 pawn. And now I thought I might have some counterplay on the e and f files. That's kind of where my play is, even though all my pawns on the queen side are on dark squares. So I started with the move rook e3. Just trying to get my rook going on this file, maybe thinking about queen e2. I was also eyeing the f5 square that's sensitive because of this g5 move. And I thought there would be some resources here. There would be resources enough to do something. So after rook e3, black played a5, just taking a little bit more space on the queen side. And this does have some merit because if a4 is played, you further clamp down on the b3 pawn and you ensure that I can never push it because of en passant. So a5 is a reasonable move. But now I go for the move queen e2. And the point is I'm trying to continue to put pressure on this e7 bishop and just get some counterplay on the king side before I'm strategically lost on the queen side. So black played bishop f8, tucking that bishop away, making sure it isn't harassed. And I went for the move. Well, before I get into this move, this is actually a great point to pause the video here because there are a lot of different plans in this position about what you can do, what course of action should be made here because, again, I am kind of worse on the queen side, so I have to get some initiative going on the king side. So the question is, how do I do that? Why don't you pause the video for a little bit and try to figure that out, and I'll give you 5 seconds to pause and consider the options. All right, hopefully you got a chance to kind of work out some of these details, some of these ideas. Before I get into my move, actually, I'm going to show you some of the options, the other things I should have explored. So one thing that could have been explored was the move f4. Just trying to open up this f file, this g file, trying to get aggressive on this line. A potential response maybe queen b7, and actually gets quite sharp here because the b2 pawn is hanging. And surprisingly, f takes g5 isn't like so amazing because it closes the g file. So rook e8 is actually to be preferred. And yeah, this position is actually quite unclear because I have queen e5, maybe queen takes g5 in some lines. Maybe after queen e5, there's rook takes f8 and queen h8 check sometimes. And this would be a total mess. Another move after f4, actually more tenacious, is actually g4, just trying to shut down the g file entirely. And the point is that if I play queen takes g4, black's actually happy to trade queens and then secure the b2 pawn, because this endgame would be winning. A3 is too weak. The c4 pawn is protected and passed, and I think that this would actually be a winner for black. So that wouldn't be so advisable. Note that a move like rook e8 that pins the bishop, may not work just because of a move like f6. The king can just creep out really quickly. So, so that was an option. But h6 g4 is a little bit more precise. And now queen b5, again, getting at this b2 pawn the play gets quite sharp. I can go rook e5, queen takes b2, rook g5 check, king h8, queen e8. And apparently there's some interesting draws with queen a1 check, bishop e1, queen takes d4 check, bishop f2, and this is actually a draw. Note that if I go to h2, that would be a very bad idea, because now rook h6 is a problem, I think, and my king's a little bit airy here, so that would not be something that you want. But yeah, it's a kind of a weird repetition here that would happen if I went for f4 and then he pushed g4. So f4 is probably the most precise move. Other moves in the position are rook e8. Now, this move actually looks quite natural, pinning the bishop and, getting pressure. But I actually rejected this one because of rook e6. And I thought that these endgames after the rooks come off the board would be extremely dangerous because of how weak my queenside pawns were. So I thought that if I don't have an attack on the king, I'm probably strategically lost. But it actually turns out here that I missed a very kind of simple double attack, which you could probably see right now is the move queen d2. And the point is that with the a5 and the g5 pawn hanging, this isn't enough to win, but it is enough to draw. I would recover one of these pawns and, maintain, a decent position. So black would probably go h6 to save this one. And then if I go queen takes a5, my d4 pawn is still weak, but, it's defensible now. And, this is something that probably would have been fine for white. What else? Another move that could have been considered is actually rook e5, eyeing the d5 pawn and the g5 pawn. And after h6, queen f3, taking advantage of the d5 pawn that's hanging. And this would actually be yet another way to play. But I actually did not play any of these moves, and I did have my eyes set on black's king side, but I had another lever that I thought made more sense, and it was the move h4. And part of the reason I thought h4 was better than f4 is because I didn't like the fact that f4 weakened this whole diagonal. I didn't like that it gave a highway. It almost gave black's piece a highway to my king on this diagonal and on the second rank. So I was reluctant to push this f pawn. I thought the h pawn did the same thing. So I thought this was a better version of f4, but it turns out it isn't, strangely enough. Now, the best move in this position was not played, and it was actually h6. Part of the reason h6 was actually a really good move is because of a line we just looked at with rook e8. Because if I throw in rook e8 now, after rook e6, rook takes, and queen d2, there's no longer this double attack that existed before, because black can play g takes h4 with tempo on my bishop on g3, and then after taking on h4, bishop g7, I can no longer just run to take on a5 because my d4 pawn is hanging, and the central pawn is a little bit more important than the flank pawn. So actually h6 would have been better, because when we transpose this rook e8 line, it's just a slightly better version. Instead, black went for g takes h4 and had a very, very different idea in mind. And this move kind of surprised me, to be honest, because I thought that opening the g file would be kind of suicidal, given the pawn is no longer protecting the king. But actually turns out this rook on b6 is quite well placed to swing over and almost become a stronger pawn to protect the black king. So after bishop h4, black actually played queen f5, and at any moment is actually ready to play rook g6 and swing that rook over. And now queen b1 check actually is a threat. So actually surprising way to play that kind of gets the job done. Now, this is another kind of critical position for me because it's kind of like, do I want to play rook g3 check and, just oppose the rooks on g6? Or do I want to go rook e8? Or is there another plan? I actually thought that something that was really dangerous was queen b1 check combined with rook h6 in some positions. And I also was a little bit worried about rook takes b2. So I thought that the safest way was to go rook g3 check, and that's what I did because at least I knew that it forced this rook to move off of the b line and that weak pawn that was being harassed so incessantly. So after rook g3 check, rook g6 was played, and then I played queen e8. And the point was now that there isn't as much pressure on the b2 pawn, I wanted to get as active as possible. And my threat was the move bishop e7, trying to get at this f8 bishop. So king g7 was played, stepping out of that pin. That's quite logical. And I have another critical decision to make because the question is, do I want to trade these rooks right away? Do I want to go bishop e7 anyway and then trade the bishops? Do I want to get in a queen trade with queen e5 check? Really tough decisions. One thing that I kind of knew was that these endgames, given the pawn structure, were not going to be pretty for me because, again, all my pawns are on dark squares and are targets, and that's not necessarily the case for black. And then, so I actually thought I need to keep some pieces on the board and wasn't going to trade everything. And so that's why actually I didn't go bishop e7 and instead went rook takes g6 check. Now, you might say, well, you are trading the rooks. The reason I traded the rooks is because I thought I couldn't move my bishop on h4 until I did so. Because if I move my bishop to e7 right away, I thought that after rook takes g3, I'd have to take with the f pawn and ruin my pawn structure, which I didn't want to do. Now, it turns out that my logic was flawed and that bishop e7 is actually the best move. But this is hard to make because after bishop e7, queen e7, rook g3, f g3, and a4, this position to my eye looks considerably easier to play black. I have no pawn breaks to speak of, and black has pretty much a perpetual whenever he wants. Now, it turns out that it's not actually so easy for black to move either. This king is kind of naked, and so this is why it would have been the safer option. But I thought that in a practical game, this is too risky. And I was even worried about this king potentially running through the center to the queen side somehow, but maybe they were just ghosts. So, anyways, I went rook g6, and after h takes g6, this does allow black to undouble, this allows black to fix his pawns pretty much. I was going to say undouble his pawns, but fix his pawns. And, yeah, my structure is still not so great. So I thought, all right, I gotta stay active, and that's why I went for the move bishop g3. And my idea was to reroute this bishop to e5, maybe provoke f6 and create some type of weakness, but to just stay active. I thought staying active was going to compensate for my structural deficiency. So after bishop g3, black went g5. I think this is a good move. Setting up the pawns on dark squares to restrict my bishop. That's a dark square bishop. Pretty logical. And I went queen d8. And the idea with queen d8, it was one of those creeper moves just to eye this a5 pawn. And also at the same time eye the g5 pawn, because I thought that, by eyeing some of these pawns, I actually do freeze the queen on f5 for a time. So after queen d8, a4 is played. And you might argue, well, aren't you just pushing this pawn to a better square? Yeah, I guess I kind of am, because now they're all in light squares on the queen side. But that's why I thought I'd attack it again with queen e8. And my rationale was pretty much that if the black queen dove in to protect this pawn or to secure some of my own on the queen side, I would have some type of counterplay on black's king. So after queen e8, f6 was played. That does cover up, bishop e5 check ideas. And I actually took on a4. And I thought, okay, this can't be too bad, can it? I'm a pawn up. This a pawn is an outside pass pawn now. It can be kind of dangerous, and black has to watch out. And black decided to actually play queen b1 check and go for my b pawn, which I thought was hugely surprising. Because after king h2, queen takes b2, I was like, this queen is at least 2 moves from the king. So I thought I must be able to get some counterplay going, some type of, perpetual check in the interim, right? And so I played the only check I have, queen d7 check, and black played king h6. And this is actually the crunch position, the critical position of the game, because now the material is equal, and it's quite clear that if I don't have a perpetual check, I will probably lose the game, because this c-pawn is too fast and is well supported by the queen. And so I have to have some type of perpetual here, I thought, to make this work. But the other issue is that my d4 pawn is hanging, and, it would seem that this is just a problem for me. I also thought that if I played queen takes d5, that might allow, again, this pawn to shuttle down the board. So after a long think here, and this was move 40, so I could think about it for quite a bit, I actually played the move f4. And f4 is not a bad move. f4 actually does keep the game together. But there was another move that was actually quite extraordinary that I could have actually played and could have considered further, and I did not because I thought it was too risky. And the move, as I suggested, was queen takes d5. And the point is that actually if c3 is played, there's this amazing line with f4, c2, and it appears that black is just queening and that there's no perpetual check and there's no way I can hold this position. But it actually turns out here that white has a draw by the skin of his teeth. And it's a quite crazy line, so I'm just going to show you. F takes g5, check. And note that if f takes g5, then my queen can come in with at least a draw with all these checks. So the king here would actually go to g6, where it steps away from any checks that I can make with my pawn, and it would appear I only have a few checks with my queen. So I go queen e4 check, king f7, and it appears that this king is just going to run away. But actually, amazingly, after queen h7 check, king e6, and queen g8 check, the queen and bishop actually do a phenomenal job of covering most of the squares that black can go to. And if king f5 is played, I can just come back around with queen d5 again. So the king has to go towards the queen side. Well, okay, king f5, I take here first. Queen d5 check, king takes f6, bishop e5 check. This is amazing line. The point is you can't go to g5 now because there's some type of discoveries. So king e7, and now queen d6 check, king e8, queen e6 check, bishop e7, queen g8 check, and now note if the bishop comes back, then there's just a repetition. So the king has to move on to d7. And now after queen d5 check, amazingly the position is a draw. Because after king c8, there's queen a8, and again, the bishop does a great job of controlling squares the queen does not. And so even with the two queens on the board, it's actually just a repetition. But good luck finding that before move 40, and honestly, good luck finding that repetition even if you have like 20 minutes on your clock. I think it's a very tough one to navigate. So I actually went for what I thought was the more logical and practical move, which was starting with f4. So after f4, black played queen takes d4, and this was move 40. We made with queen takes d4, we both made the time control, and I had more time to think here about, how I could try and save this game, because it is quite clear in this moment that the only way I can hold this game again is with a repetition. And I'm a pawn down now. I don't have limited arsenal to give checks, but there's a very important and only way to hold this game, and unfortunately, I missed it. I missed the way. Why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what that way is? All right, hopefully you got a chance to take a look at the position and try and figure it out. The move that holds is actually the move queen e8. And this is a move I did not play, but it's the only move that holds. And the point is that, you attack this bishop, but in many lines you're threatening f5, which gives you this checkmate on g6. So the point is that if, let's say, bishop c5 is played, this would be a blunder. Queen h8 check, king g6, queen g8 check, king h6, and f5 would actually win the game because of this mate on g6. And the issue is that there's no perpetual on g1 because I can actually hide. After king h3, queen h1, bishop h2, there are no more dangerous checks. And after g4, I can actually go queen takes g4. And yeah, there's just nothing else here. And believe it or not, I actually did look at a line like this. But the thing that I missed, sadly, is that I actually thought I had to take this with the king. And of course, in this version, this would not work because of queen takes g2 check. So actually, I actually had seen this line through and through, and I just missed the last move I could take with the queen instead of the king. So that's really unfortunate, because if I had seen that, I would have gone for this line. Now, instead of playing queen e8, well, actually, let me get into another line with queen e8. So queen e8, bishop c5 doesn't work. So let's say you go king g7 to protect the bishop. Well, now I can give a check here on d7, and after king g8, a check on e6, and now I can actually take on g5 because you can't recapture because bishop e5 is a skewer. And so after queen e6, trying to trade queens, I still have to be careful. I can't go like queen f7 because that allows the trade of queens. And then this is a winning endgame for black with the connected passed pawns. But instead, I could go queen c8, and I'm hitting the f8 bishop, and this one is actually enough to hold. So king g7 doesn't work, and if you go bishop g7, here again I have this f5 idea, which catches the king kind of in a bind on g6. And now with no check, with black having no checks, the only thing that black can do is go king h7, and from here we'd have a repetition. So that would have been the way, this queen e8 move. But unfortunately I had missed it, and instead I went for the only other way I thought I could get counterplay, which was queen h3 check. But unfortunately, this move with best play should actually lose. Black played king g6. That's a good move. And now I went f5 check, but the difference here is that I'm not actually, it takes me 2 moves to actually threaten something on g6. And so after this king g7 move, which is played, I actually don't have any checks. And that is a problem because it actually means that black can shuttle the queen back towards the king to protect it. So I went for my only source of counterplay here, queen h5, which does threaten queen g6, but this position is winning for black. And the reason for that is because of the move bishop e7. And the point is now this king can actually scamper away if I continue to check it. So if queen g6 check, king f8, queen h6 check, king e8, and then if I could keep checking, the king just escapes on the other side. And I can put up a decent fight, but it's not something that will, hold, because ultimately my only check here is on b7, or the only decent one, and then the king runs back the other way. And it will always take me 2 moves to get checks in, and then I'll have to come back to the other side. And in the meantime, this pawn just continues to go down the board. So this position is actually lost if bishop e7 is played after queen h5. Unfortunately, here for my opponent, Illya did not see this and instead went for the move queen a7. And this one actually breathes new life into the position for me because I'm actually able to get in this check on g6 and the king stays in the corner. So I went queen g6 check, and after king h8, went queen takes f6. And now the material is level, and it's not so easy to play. And after queen g7, I actually had a few different ways I could have played this position, but I went for what I believed was the safest one in queen e6, point being that I'm threatening bishop e5, getting at this king, winning the queen, and I thought, now I'm really putting the pressure on black to just hold the game, because now this king is actually quite weak, and my f-pawn is becoming a factor. Black played king h7, trying to just get out of checks. One thing I do want to point out with queen e6, which is actually quite remarkable, by the way, is the fact that, you might say, well, weren't you talking about queen trades with the connected pass pawns not being good for you? Well, I actually calculated in this particular version with the material equal, and it turns out that queen h6 check here is actually not at all dangerous to me, because amazingly, after queen takes h6 check, bishop a takes h6, and a4, all of a sudden the a-pawn is a really, really significant factor. And if you go bishop g7 just to try and stop that pawn, I go a5, bishop d4, a6, and if you go c3, I actually have bishop e1. Ooh, that's my phone. And the point is actually that after bishop e1, my bishop comes to d2. It's actually hitting the g5 pawn, and it's actually a winning position for white, amazingly. After c2, bishop d2, my king can actually come up to g4. I could take the g5 pawn, and I would have an a6 pawn and two connected pass pawns, and this bishop would be doing a great job holding up black's pawns. So, believe it or not, the queen trade's actually risking a loss for black. Now, another way you could handle that after a4, a5, bishop d4, a6 is to go king g7. But after king g7, again, king h3, king f6, king g4, and amazingly, my bishop gets back in time to challenge the g5 pawn and hold up these pawns. So, just an incredible line, and I think Illya realized that the queen trade actually gives him more problems than it's worth. So instead, after queen e6, black played king h7, and I went queen takes d5, and all of a sudden, we are talking about a position where I was, pawns down, and I'm actually a pawn up. What a turnaround. Black played c3 now. The c-pawn is the one pride in black's position. And I went bishop e5, challenging the queen and this pawn on c3. And now queen h6 check was played, and I still have to be careful because, my king is a little bit airy. I stepped up to g3, just trying to be precise. Note that if king g1, I thought, c2 can be quite scary coming with check, so I did not want to allow this. So I went king g3, so my king is not actually, walking into someone queening with check. And I had calculated that after queen h4 check, my king could just run away to f3, and there would be no more serious checks. For instance, queen h4, king f3. There's only one more check with the queen, queen h5, and then my king could just scamper away. So after king g3, black played c2, and now I went queen f7 check, and this one I knew would hold the game for me because after bishop g7 and bishop takes g7, you could play queen h4 check and queen get a second queen, but it actually would be losing because if queen f4 check, king e2, and c1 queen, it's actually me that mates first on g7. Or excuse me, not bishop f6. That's the wrong way. Bishop f8, so that the king can't go to h6. The king will have to go to g7, and then I'm the one that mates first. So in fact, you actually can't queen your pawn, and after bishop takes g7, you actually pretty much need to recapture with the queen. And after queen takes g7, Illya actually offered me a draw, which I accepted because, now to deal with the c-pawn, I actually need to give a perpetual check. And after queen h5, king g8, queen e8, this would just end in a draw. Note that if, black blocks, it doesn't change the story at all. So, yeah, I was actually reasonably satisfied with this draw, given the pressure that I was under for most of the game. And I also think it was a real lesson for me in the exchange Slav that, by keeping this bishop on the board, with black keeping the dark square bishop on the board and just leaving mine on f4, it actually turned out that he had more play on my queen side than I had on his. And so that's something that I'm definitely going to keep in mind if I ever faced this particular line of the exchange Slav again with the black pieces. It might be something that I might consider playing with black. So very, very interesting and a good lesson for me. And I'm just glad the lesson came in a draw and not a loss, as it often does. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.